So I think a starting idea as we get on this cover page, something to think about is wind turbines, which many of you who are going to go to the Altamont Pass tomorrow are going to get a sense of. Modern wind turbines are huge. Think the wingspan of a 777. Think about, just very, very large. And this is meant to give a sense of that here. So the typical kind of big questions we want to look at: what's the role? What's the significance? What are the big challenges? A little bit different onshore versus offshore. What are the improvements being made to how we integrate wind into the grid? Turbine technology, what's going on, operations, and then as always, with no matter what we're doing in terms of how we're delivering energy services, there's always environmental consequences that we need to think about and try and put in perspective about, are they watermelon issues? Are they blueberry issues? Do they occur in all situations? Try and get some understanding of that. Tried to give you the things we think that are super vital and important for you to understand. The usual optional, the wind visualization tools that Diana was showcasing are listed here. They're really fun things to share with other people. And reminding you where we are as we blast through our journey to understand energy. So over here in the world of what we think of as purely renewable sources of energy: wind, solar, ocean, etc. So this is one of my favorite cartoons because it touches on this topic that our perception of things is easily distorted. And that implies a judgment that I'm suggesting that there's a distortion. But some things that happen slowly over time, like adding one, some of you remember I grew up in Palo Alto. I remember when Highway 101 was 2 lanes each direction. It's now 5 in most cases each direction. And that's just evolution and creep. And driving is a personal activity that we want to put a car on and go somewhere. And so our tolerance of expanding a freeway is very different than our tolerance, because we have a very distant relationship with a wind turbine that is delivering renewable electricity to the grid. And we're used to seeing a certain landscape that doesn't have turbines poking up on it. And then all of a sudden they're there and people are like, what the hell, right? We're indignant. But when we're doing construction on 101, we're less indignant, other than sometimes it interrupts the flow of traffic, right? And so thinking about, because one of the biggest issues around wind in a world where it has many, many benefits is that visual issue, which then triggers those acronyms known as NIMBY, not in my backyard, and BANANA, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So when you go to the psychology, how do we feel about nuclear power? How do we feel about wind? This is so that's why this is so early in the lecture, to show that cartoon and cause us to stop and think a little bit about how we think about things. One of my favorite, I have a tendency as a human being to make my life complicated. One of the things I really like about wind is you can apply that principle called KISS to it, keep it simple, stupid. It's pretty simple. When you think of you don't have a supply chain for the fuel, you just have to locate your wind turbines where the fuel is, which is the wind, right? And when you really dig into the components of a wind farm, it's a lot closer to Lego than anything other than solar, probably. It's pretty simple compared to the complexity of other things we're trying to do, compared to a fusion plant, and I'm not making a judgment on all our other sources, but it's pretty simple. So those are things, and those are drivers or things that are pros. We have policy drivers that have helped us that we're going to talk about with wind. One of the most common, as you might remember, because I haven't been in class for a while, I live and breathe in the world of early stage climate tech right now, and our investors are very uncomfortable with the outcome of the election. And I've made the comment to them that, and this is kind of useful context for this class as a whole, and we're going to see a graph that shows it, federal support for wind was incredibly choppy and intermittent. We had production tax credits for 2 years, 3 years, 1 year. Blah, 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 blah. So it actually created way more entropy for wind in our country than the things that were really solid about driving wind was the states who passed renewable portfolio standards and what we call C&I customers, commercial and industrial customers, who said, damn, I want to diversify where I'm getting my power. I want to take control of my destiny. I'm going to sign a PPA directly with that wind farm to support my data center or to support my refinery or my aluminum plant. It's those things that really provided stability and allowed wind to scale the way we're going to review how quickly it has moved going forward. So this is, one of my favorite words is context. So when you say solar, right, it can mean lots of things. When you say biomass, it can mean lots of things. So when we say wind, we're largely talking about onshore utility scale wind farms that are, they're utility scale and they're usually on the, they're on the front of the meter. They're not behind the meter. Behind the meter being where the wind power is being used directly by a manufacturing facility. And one of the most common, or one of the best, if you live here, examples of behind the meter wind is on Highway 80 on your way to Davis or Sacramento. There's a Budweiser brewery, and there's 2 or 3 turbines there that are behind the meter turbines. And so that's an example. They're full-size turbines, but they're generating power directly to that industrial activity. So then we have offshore utility scale, and then we have these behind the meter and smaller turbines, and they're a very small part of the global market. So most of the information on the last 2 is in the appendix of this lecture. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Wind is used to generate electricity. There's, as I mentioned, there's a few exceptions. There's work going on now to say, how can we harness the wind in shipping to make, I mean, and obviously for recreational sailing as well. So in the notes on this slide, it's this, we make the comment to point out the fact that, we have onshore versus offshore, we have utility scale versus smaller, we have behind the meter versus in front of the meter, and we have grid connected versus remote. So, another category of thinking about wind, some of you may have grown up or worked in settings that are super remote, and there are little integrated microgrids set up, usually with solar and wind, and maybe a diesel or propane backup, not connected to the grid at all. And so that is another application of wind as well, typically much smaller turbines. So it's just trying to contextualize what are all the ways that we can use wind. So we have 6 topics we're going to try and blast through. I thought about wearing my Hokas, which is what I usually do when I'm trying to get through a lot of material, and I decided I wanted to wear my boots. So we'll see if I can do this without having my Hokas on. Really simple point of this slide, we have a gigantic resource. We have barely tapped it. This is a sense of showing you where the windiest parts are and why people all around the world, many of the developers of wind, owner-operators, and manufacturers associated with the wind industry are from outside the United States. And they've come to the United States because you can see we have one of the best wind resources in the world near people, near load, near manufacturing, near activity. And so we are not the number one. China dominates wind development onshore and offshore. We're a distant number 2. But part of the narrative for our role in wind to continue to grow is we have an extraordinary resource. It would be a different story. And that's as a nation. Remember, the southeast of our country doesn't have much to work with, but the rest of the country has a lot. So I think the number is less than 1% of the potential has been harnessed to date. So we have, based on what we know and the technology we know, and my guess is as technology improves, how much we can harvest. The potential of wind actually is just going to grow because the technology to harness the wind is going to improve, and it's been improving a lot just during the time that I have been. This happens of all the topics, because I used to give a whole bunch of the lectures in this class, that I've spent a lot of time in the wind industry over the last 20, since it really started happening in the United States, which I got really nostalgic looking at some of these slides, thinking about that. So this is showing you global. This is not the US, this is global. On the right-hand side, the rate of growth. So solar is growing faster. Why is solar growing faster besides its site specificness, which is, so there's 2 aspects. I'm going to ask it a different way. There's 2 aspects to the site specificity of solar, which is there are many more surfaces, and solar is much more modular and easier to install right now than wind is at scale. So we need transmission to deliver wind at scale. We need transmission more than we do for how much we can pepper and distribute solar out there. And so one of that site specificity, it has to do with, the sun shines more consistently in places maybe than the wind consistently blows. There's plenty of sun in Florida, for instance, compared to wind. But the transmission is another layer of the site specificity that's holding winds back growth-wise relative to solar. So solar is on this big growth curve. You're going to see that wind is still dominating today, the installed mix. in the world in the United States. But I wanted you to see this ramp on the left of what's going on, and the green is showing you the march of offshore adding to the mix. Largely first pioneered in Europe, then China just went in full tilt, and the US is doing more in the last 2 years under the Biden administration than it's ever done before, and the states are all charged up. So we talked about New York and Massachusetts being leaders in the US to date, and it's very, very early in the race. That is not a coincidence that the state of New York decided, I think it's over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, New York said no gas. New York is sitting on a ton of gas. They won't let pipelines through the state, and they will not drill. And so if you're not going to do that, what are you going to do? So the state of New York has made a huge commitment to offshore wind. The state of Massachusetts just passed, post-federal election, the state of Massachusetts just passed a huge clean energy law. So one of the things we'll get into is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which we talked about in offshore oil and gas. We don't know if that agency is even going to exist 6 months from now, because we need the federal cooperation to do the permitting offshore, but the states are very motivated, particularly in the Northeast coast, you'll see. And part of it is because the Northeast states they have tons of NIMBY issues. They're very densely populated. They don't want more fossil fuels. It's hard to site onshore wind, so they want to go offshore. Okay, so we are going to look here at what's going on globally. The march of wind. Wind is at 8%. You see that relative to solar and other sources of renewable energy there. Solar will cross wind, I believe, is my prediction, and maybe Kirsten said that, on the world level, but this is where the horse race is right now. And then wind's at 10%. And I think one of the things I wanted to point out on here, it's in the notes, rather than being on the slide, just not to clutter the slide, but it's really important. When you look at top countries for wind generation, China generated twice as much last year as the US did, and then the US generated 4 times as much as Germany, which was the third most important country for generating wind. So we have some pretty big gaps between countries that are 1, 2, and 3 on how much wind is getting produced. So out of that 8%, China is 2 times greater than the United States, and the United States is 4 times greater than Germany in terms of those, but those are the 3 leading countries out of that 8%. And then when you look at the 10% in the United States, and we'll look at this more in a moment, Texas has 3 times more wind than Iowa, and Iowa's number 2, and then Oklahoma's number 3. So we've got some pretty big gaps. So if you really wanted to get really simple about life, you say what really matters in wind, you'd say is China and Texas. Okay, so I just simplified it for you. There we go. Off to the races. So this is showing what percent of wind. So how much has wind, what share of the electric mix is wind in that country? So in the United States, it's 10%. China, it's about 10% of their entire electric mix, and they are very determined. China is super motivated to get to reduce its dependence on coal in a world where their country's economy, in spite of concerns about population growth and economy, other aspects of their economy, they're still very dependent. And as we've talked about, all these countries need energy for data, for AI, and all these other demands. So there's no lack of demand for energy overall, and they want renewables to be as big a share as possible. So this is just showing that Denmark, Iceland, Uruguay are countries that have integrated lots of wind into their overall mix. Some of those are very small power markets. But that integration level is part of the art of how do you deal with the intermittency, how do you deal with the transmission, et cetera, et cetera. So we are now still in our 1 of 6 topics. We're going to get in more on the significance of onshore wind. And this is a photograph that I took of one of my business partners at MAP, the first investment firm that I built. And we got involved in incubating wind projects in 2003. And this is out in the central part of the US in Kansas. And this is a project that got built, but we did all the early stage development for it. We picked the location, we got the interconnect deposit, we put up the Met towers, we identified that this was a location that one of the big owner operators would like to buy this prospect, this idea that we had put together. We essentially organized all the Lego, but we didn't, metaphorically, but we didn't assemble it. We sold the Lego package for a development fee and a royalty to a big owner-operator. So this was going out to see the COD, the commercial operation date, and celebrate the fact that that wind farm was now going to generate electricity and generate revenue to all our investors. So we were pretty excited about that. All right, so this is the China story with some facts behind it. It's showing you on the left total installations. We're just talking about onshore. And you see China's dominance and the fact that the United States is about a third in terms of total megawatts of capacity that are installed. So then you see Germany, that's a fraction of that. And then everybody else is just little itty bitty pieces. And then look at what China did in 1 year relative to everybody else. I mean, this is a hardcore, serious march. So when I looked at this, I thought about, one of my specialties is stating the obvious, but it may not be obvious to you yet. We have a very different governance in our country, how we're organized, than China does. And do we have any lawyers in the class? We got one. So they can probably thank you for your expertise because I'm just going to botch language. But the idea of eminent domain or force majeure, the idea that the government can just come in and take over and plow through and say, we're going to put in transmission. We don't care whose land it is or what's going on or who we're going to displace, which is what they did with the Three Gorges Dam as well on the hydro side of things. So it's part of what allows China, their centralized government, the power that their federal government has to come in and make these decisions that overrides what's going on the provincial or the municipal level. This is what is giving them speed and scale. And they not only do it with where they build out the wind farms, but they have a very long-term view and integrated plan around the transmission. So that is what allows what's happening on the right, and we're going to see it continue to play out going forward in a world where all European countries and the US, we have a much more complex decision-making process than you see in China. And it's not unique to wind. So I think I shared with you, I used to teach a class called China Energy Systems. I would bring 40 Stanford students to China for 2 weeks over spring break. We went every other year from 2006 to 2016. When we first started, we went all over the country. And the first year we went in 2006, we had to go everywhere by plane. 10 years later, we could go all those places by high-speed rail. They just built it. Same idea. We have trouble building transmission lines in our country, pipelines, because of the role of states. And there's other people in this class that can speak better to kind of the difference in our governance structure. This is another way to tell the China story. So this is just onshore wind in 2023. Look how much they built compared to anybody else. So hopefully some of the right people in our country will get a little inspiration from this and say, if we really want to get where we want to go, we made the point, the gentleman here made the point that wind is incredibly cost effective. One of the places where your costs can escalate, which we're dealing with in offshore wind, is in this regulatory process, which China does not bear because they just go do it. So it's just putting this in context for everybody to understand. So this is a very different topic. Switching gears, and I'm radically bringing you back to the United States. This slide, I'm going to change the title of it. It says wind regimes vary greatly across the US. Well, they actually vary greatly all around the world. I just happen to have a US map to make the point that developing wind in the Columbia River Gorge, which is a great place to go kite sailing, there's a lot of wind there. That is a very different wind regime on the Oregon and Washington borders, that gorge where we develop projects. That's very different than developing projects in San Antonio, Texas. Okay, so the wind varies enormously just within Texas, which has its own grid called ERCOT. In that power market, in that grid, we had 7 different major wind regimes that we were developing wind projects in terms of the weather. And so what I'm talking about is during the day, so in different parts of the country, the wind blows more at night and during the day and has more seasonal variation. The nature and texture and pattern of wind and how that fits into the grid is highly variable depending on where you are, and it's driven by temperature differentiations that create differences in pressure that create the wind regimes in those different areas. So it sends you back to that hint map to see what's going on. And obviously, besides the onshore resource, we have the offshore resource to be thinking about. So there is not a all size fits all aspect to the wind resource and the different wind regimes. And so that's where people with that expertise to assess the resource are a very important part of wind project development. We're now in the US, because of that, have transitioned kind of whoop, into the US from the world view. And I was talking about the bumpiness of federal policy, which is the reason we have this sawtooth kind of pattern to annual net capacity additions. The federal production tax credit. In the very beginning, when I took this class in 1980, we had an investment tax credit, and that was a disaster because it invited people to put up a wind turbine anywhere because they could write off the cost of it with an investment tax credit, whether it produced anything or not. So at the Altamont Pass, where some of you are going tomorrow, I went there for the first time in 1980, and there were a whole bunch of turbines, and nothing was going on. They're just sitting there because they were really poorly located, but the people who'd invested in them had gotten their money back, 50% of their money back just for putting it in the ground. So now we have a production tax credit, and we've had one, and it's phased out largely. But from a policy point of view, it was hard to get the production tax credit pushed through Congress. So they do it, well, we'll do it for 1 year. We'll do it for 2 years. Maybe we'll do it for 3. Oh, I don't know. And so at a certain point, those of us that were in the industry, it's like, okay, we'll take it if we get it. It's like ice cream on the pie. If we still like the pie, which is we want to do wind. If we get ice cream, great. But we're going to make pie. And that's just get out and get the very best wind projects developed. So this is the slide that made me pause this morning and say, damn. In fact, I'm going to modify this slide and say, so I got into the wind industry in 2003. Look how much wind we had. That's what I like to do, is I like to get on waves before they've really started and ride the hell out of them and get off of them. We sold what we were doing in 2020 in wind to global infrastructure partners because the industry is very commoditized and competitive, and there are a lot of players in it, and our ability to make money in the industry was getting into things ahead of everybody. And we tied up some of the best locations for wind projects in the United States between 2003 and 2020. And some of them are still being built today because from the time you come up with an idea and you get your interconnect and you get your wind data and you get your land and you get your community support, you still have to wait because there are these transmission queues, and we don't have enough transmission in our country in most places to meet the demand. So I'm going to say that again because we'll catch it later, which is you got to have a good wind resource. You got to have an interconnect on the grid. You have to have demand for that wind power, what we call load. So one of the things we did is we looked for places where there was new load being built, a new refinery, a new aluminum plant, we were chasing data centers 23 years ago when they were first getting built, because that was a new source of load, it needed new power, and we had those C&I customers, we had the FANG companies who were like, yeah, we want to sign a PPA with you. So that would help us get a wind project that helped drive wind and solar. You need those elements in place. But then those transmission queues, because building transmission is so slow in our country, we literally have projects that we started incubating 15 years ago that are now getting built. All the other parts were ready, but the transmission was not in place. I'm guessing Kirsten may have talked a little bit, or Diana did, about the challenges around our transmission system. So this is showing what is coming. No, US planned, yes. So, and you see that solar is the big story in terms of, again, it can be much more distributed. We can put the solar where the transmission already is. We don't have as many siting issues with a lot of solar because this blends utility scale solar that can be of many scales. If some of you in New England know that some of the states have had a huge campaign to put utility scale solar, but to put it like in the highway roundabouts and things like that. Well, siting things like that is a lot less complicated than siting a gigawatt of solar. So solar's flexibility around scale is allowing it to grow faster than wind is. And so those curves and the bars that I showed you before, solar is going to pass wind, but wind is going to continue to grow. So this is really interesting to me in terms of, okay, in the United States, since we're a little bit of a US-centric, which we can, it's where we have a lot of data and where a lot of us are, and that's where we're standing today. This is putting in context, it turns out California is the 4th largest generator of electricity, which is the light blue bar. In between Texas and California is Pennsylvania and Florida. So Texas produces 540 megawatt hours. So it's just a huge, like I said, Texas is our China within our country in terms of what's going on there. Florida is about half as much, 260. This is in the notes. Pennsylvania, which doesn't have a lot of wind development, it's at 236, and then California. So California is number 4. You see there. So it's number 4 in terms of electricity of any state. 22% of Texas's, all its electricity is wind. Iowa has the highest mix, Grace's state, of all the electricity being generated in Iowa, almost 60% is coming from wind. So that's a very high level of a utility being able to integrate this intermittent resource. That wasn't possible. So AI, machine learning, all kinds of things. I have a whole slide that talks about how we're getting better at integrating. And the profile of wind in Iowa is friendly towards integration too. It's more predictable and consistent than some other wind patterns in some of those other regimes. We wanted to call out 3 states here that have really high levels of, and most people wouldn't think South Dakota, 55% of the electricity that they're generating there. It's not a giant amount of electricity needed in South Dakota, but it's making the point about integration. Wyoming has a huge wind resource. They don't have any population to speak of. And Phil Anschutz, who is a big oil and gas billionaire, has made a lot of money on that. He has worked for the last 15 years and has built a big transmission line to move wind from Wyoming to California. So all these dynamics about where is the resource, that is part of the story as well. And so part of what's allowed Texas to have as much wind as Oklahoma has, more than, to have as much wind as it has, is the state of Texas has proactively built out an enormous amount of transmission capacity internal to its state, called the CREZ, which I'll show you in a moment. All right, so this is to show you, this is the key word that I will highlight when I give this next time, is the word capacity, because the next slide is going to be about energy production. But so it's saying that the capacity in the US matches up with where the resource is, which is in the middle of the country. Texas is number 1, Iowa's number 2, Oklahoma's number 3, and all those little dots are where the wind farms are. So that's in megawatts or capacity. This is showing you in terms of energy, or billions of kilowatt hours. Same ranking, Texas 1, Iowa 2, Oklahoma 3. But it shows you where they are. So this is just a bunch of cool geospatial stuff. Now this slide is important because it gives you a laundry list that if you were a grid integrator and you were to say, if I wanted to have my life defined, if I wanted to define success on my ability to just add more and more percentages of wind into my mix, what's my quiver of tools that I have to boost the amount of wind that I have? And so that's what all these bullets are. It's like, check, okay, I want geographic diversity. I want a diverse portfolio. A lot of it is thinking about like an investment portfolio. Do you want everything in 2 stocks? No. Well, unless you've happened to pick NVIDIA and Tesla or whatever that be. But in general, when you look at investment theory, you want diversification. What this is showing at the bottom is the variability. On the bottom one shows you when you only have 15 turbines. But the more turbines you add that you're putting into your portfolio, the more you start to get to a place where you can simulate baseload, especially if you have a diversity of wind regimes, so that in general, you're getting a production curve that becomes more and more predictable. So these are all the tools on the right-hand side that and there's probably a few more, that we can use. And this is part of the story that you've heard before too, is we started out with these provincial power markets where we didn't have much geographic range to ensure reliability of our power system. And now, because our power markets are bigger, we can integrate wind over a broader geography than we could before. So in California, bringing it closer to home, several of you are going to have the great privilege. It's a fabulous field trip. And again, when I think about what it was like when I went there in 1980, there were bazillion turbines that were only 100 kilowatt turbines. They looked like a whole bunch of little egg beaters. And now, we have 2, 3, 4 megawatt turbines and far fewer of them, which I have a slide that shows that in a moment. But California, unlike the plains, where it's very flat actually, but you have these consistent winds, almost all our wind capacity is tied to the Bernoulli principle in situations where we have these mountain passes where the air temperature and pressure is being affected by these narrow passes where the wind moves through. And so this is just highlighting for those of you that have spent different time in California where the hotspots are for commercial wind power development, summarizing the status of world, US, California, and then Stanford is the solar wonder with all those caveats you already know about to put that in context. And we're going to go offshore. So lots of benefits. State of New York, lots of benefits. So a key thing is kind of a difference in regime. If you're going offshore and you have a shallow water depth, you can have turbines that are anchored in the ground and in the seafloor. If you don't, so that's the northeast coast or north central coast is where we don't have any wind off Florida unless it's a hurricane. So we're talking about the mid and North Atlantic coast. There is a broad shelf and relatively shallow water, so we don't need to do floating technology there. On the west coast, from Washington all the way down California, we have the geology is different, and we've got the San Andreas along our whole coast. And so you drop off into deep water really quickly. So the only way to have offshore wind on the west coast is to have floating. So going for context, if you say offshore, what are we doing? Are we doing fixed or are we going floating as part of the story? You can imagine floating is a lot more expensive. So these are just some key ideas. It's a big resource. There's fewer NIMBY and banana issues, but believe me, there are plenty of NIMBY and banana issues offshore. The fishermen are worked up about it. There are military purposes for the offshore. The Navy and the Coast Guard could care a lot about it. There are shipping lanes. If you talk to the people at the very important MOMBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Research Institute, they care a great deal about the fisheries and the species protection issues. So it's not a walk in the park to site things in the offshore at all. It's just easier and bigger. You can have bigger, taller turbines. You have more flexibility to go to scale offshore than you do onshore. So you drag your turbines on a ship offshore rather than, one of our constraints onshore is, can the nacelle and the turbines fit under an underpass? So we're really limited by, when you're onshore, whereas offshore, you don't have overpasses. You have to worry about fitting equipment through, things like that. So rather than reading through all this is meant to be, and there's some more notes on the slide, kind of it all adds up to cost, but then cost is always a trade-off against value, long-term value. And if you're a state or a country and you care about the environment and your economy and your jobs, and if you take a full systems view of things, then what's cost versus what's an investment in a long-term viable industry that is going to be good for the state of New York or California and our decarbonization goals, because the cost of something early on is much higher than it is 20 years later. We see that over and over and over again. So there's a lot of policy discussion about, it's so expensive right now. Well, in the long run, we're going to look back and say, we're so glad we did it. So those kinds of trade-offs. So this shows you, no surprise, China is #1 in terms of total installations, you see at the bottom, and in terms of what happened last year. There is some dialogue mainly going on in Europe about combining offshore wind with hydrogen projects. And so you see big strategic chemical players in the mix. Ørsted is a big player, Shell, Engie. Seeing Shell and Ørsted, these are companies that have long histories in offshore oil and gas. There's a lot of transferability of all the offshore infrastructure, the platforms, the drilling ships, all those kinds of things, the port activity and all that infrastructure, very relatable and transferable to offshore wind. And so you see a lot of engagement of those players, whether they're service companies or whether they're the oil and gas companies themselves in this space. I would say offshore wind really started in Europe. China grabbed it and is running with it hard. They're way ahead of Europe now. But Europe's doing everything they can to deal with the Germany issue that we had in the Kahoot. And then the US, where it's building out all new permitting processes, dealing with all kinds of issues. The very famous people that lived in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, who are very environmentally oriented, did not want Cape Wind. So we had let's build Cape Wind. Then it was shot down. Now we are building broadly in that broader Cape Cod offshore area in Massachusetts, but it took a long time to get the right people and the right approach to have it be something that was palatable and something people were proud of and excited about. This kind of tension at a high level, besides the bird and bat issue that we're going to talk about, is a wind turbine beauty or is it ugly? It is this aesthetic thing that's really, really interesting. So, and it takes a long time sometimes for things to be psychologically normalized, like the expanding freeway. So this is showing you where the offshore wind resource is in the United States for fixed or floating. So whole lot, showing a lot of opportunity up in Alaska, but there the market's much smaller, building out the transmission, et cetera. So this is where you hold your breath and say, oh my God, I can't believe Jane gave me a slide this dense. So this is mainly entertainment for those of you that care about offshore wind or you're from some of these East Coast states, because the degree of permitting and proposals that's going on is just going like this. It's really growing from where it was 10 years ago. And then a nice summary of we have 4 projects, the operating turbines in 2024. It shows you where they are. There's 4 states that have offshore wind. A lot of this has happened very recently. And then it's showing you where all the proposals are. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on it. And this is a different view of what's in the pipeline, what's different stages of what's going on, and all the states that are engaged in this. And again, this is something that Donald Trump has made a lot of noise about, the fact that he wants to kill offshore wind. Does he really have the ability to do it? Will that be a higher priority than all the other things he wants to kill? I don't know, and I don't want to offend anybody. This is not meant to be a political forum, but not all, like he's not talking about geothermal. In fact, his new Secretary of Energy loves geothermal. So geothermal is not really at risk in the same way. If you said, what are 5 things that sound like they're at risk? Offshore wind sounds like one of them at the moment, but that's rhetoric. We don't have any other evidence to go with it. This is a bit of, if we were going to do offshore wind in California, where would we do it? So if you think of project development as like baseball, that can we get off home plate and get to first base? I would say a friend of mine from when I went to business school leads the 501c6 or 7. It's a nonprofit, but it's an industry association that has 60 companies who all want offshore wind on offshore of California, Oregon, and Washington. The nonprofit's called, I think it's called California Offshore Wind or something very close to that. So anyhow, they have all been working. They're kind of on first base. They probably think they're closer to second, but somewhere between first and second base in terms of actually having offshore wind in California. In the places they have leases, because the first 3 miles offshore, you'll remember from oil and gas, are controlled by the state. Once you get beyond 3 miles offshore, it's federal waters. These are the only 2 places in California, after a really elaborate process, that people can imagine having offshore wind floating in California to get up and get started. So if anybody's really interested in it, it's easy to Google this and get more information. And you see at the bottom, BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, manages everything from ocean mineral mining to oil and gas development to offshore wind development. And that's where you can be tracking what's going on. So, and it's not easy. You need stuff like this. And you need the Jones Act, which manages shipping of any kind, controls. You have to get any kind of ship you have that you want to have to carry wind turbines and nacelles out to install them. It has to be a particular kind of ship that has to go through its own regulatory process. So you have to get regulation for the transmission. You have to get regulation for the ship that's going to carry the equipment out. This is complex. So if you're looking for speed and scale, just whipping out offshore wind is hard unless you're China, because China orchestrates, certainly like a symphony, just pulls together all the pieces of this that are necessary to go to scale. So this is showing innovative floating platforms. We have 4 operating floating wind farms in the world, 2 off Scotland, 1 off Norway, 1 off Portugal. So this whole floating offshore thing is very new, and the grand majority of what is going on, you notice China's not there. So everything that China's building out as the global leader is fixed platform in relatively shallow water. I got to go back to this, but this is important. That's Kirsten Stasio. Okay, so this is when she worked with me at MAP before she went on to lead Nevada's Clean Energy Fund. And this was, we went out to visit another one of our projects that we had incubated. So this idea of scale, these turbines are big. Okay. So Bernoulli, hopefully everybody learned about Bernoulli in middle school, high school, and again in college. So I'm not going to spend our precious time on that. And there's a great little video that talks about the idea of lift, basically. And that is the whole way that we end up with this fabulous math equation of the power equation for a wind farm. And it points to the fact that velocity, the wind speed, as was mentioned around our quiz, is we want to be in locations where the wind speed is predictably high, and we want to, and the wind speed is higher the further you get off the ground. So that has a lot to do with us raising the height of our towers, and then it's very useful to sweep more area as we continue to bring our tower height up. And so that has been literally, so those of you that go to Altamont, Jane went for the first time in 1980. I was 21 years old. Thought it was the coolest thing in the world, but I wondered why so many of the turbines weren't turning. They had all kinds of issues with that lattice tower structure because all the birds nested on it, all the special birds that we were trying not to kill. And so we figured out pretty quickly we better have smooth towers so the birds couldn't nest on them. So one of the tricks you'll hear about Altamont is like going to Draeger's or Whole Foods for birds. They love it. They love surfing the winds themselves. It's really good food sources down on the ground. And so managing the bird issues in these passes is tricky. And just on the bird and bat topic, which we'll get to, the other big area where bird issues, even though they don't tend to be precious bird species-wise, is, Portugal put a whole bunch, in Spain did a whole bunch of coastal offshore wind in areas where there was a whole bunch of seabird migration. So it turns out Audubon loves wind power, but they become deep partners with the wind industry because Audubon knows that far more species will die from fossil fuel issues than they will from wind. But they also know that the destiny of wind and its success is deeply connected to understanding the flyways and the relative value of certain bird species relative to others so that we can make really conscious trade-offs about that. So this is just a lot. This is all meant to say the same thing as the trend is let's go bigger. And the economics, if you can get more wind for free from the same turbine by getting faster wind speeds and sweeping more area, you don't have to be too big a math genius to know that's where you're kind of getting some of your economies of scale, and you can drive the cost per megawatt hour down. So this slide is in here just for lingo's sake. Every resource has lingo. I don't think this makes it to the level of showing up on a test. It's more to help you understand it. So this idea that you can stick a turbine in the ground, and when I got into this industry, there were like, if you wanted to put a wind turbine in, there were like 2 different kinds you could order. Now there's like a whole suite of different and all kinds of variations. But what mattered is at what speed, wind speed, can that turbine kick in, because it needs a certain minimum speed, and then a maximum speed where it's just too stressful to the turbine that it's going to cut out. So it really defines the range. So just familiarizing yourself with it. When people talk about cut in and cut out speed, what the heck are they talking about is something that I wanted you to understand. All right, so there's Kirsten again. She's our Carol Merrill model, right? So just giving you a sense of how big a nacelle is. It literally is like, she just ordered a whole bunch of electric school buses for the state of Nevada that the IRA helped fund, which is fabulous. But these nacelles are really big, and they have the guts inside them of what we use to catch the mechanical energy of the wind and turn it into electricity. And we'll dig into that in a moment. So inside the nacelle is the gearbox, et cetera. So just having you have a sense of the general anatomy, particularly those of you who are going to go see these in the field, and those of you that aren't, to just have a sense of, okay, what are these called? The hub, the nacelle, the blades, the tower. And it turns out that a lot of, did any of you ever do much rock climbing indoors in a gym or outside? So people who love rock climbing love to be a windsmith because inside the tower is a ladder. There's a door, you'll get to see it, those of you who are in the field, and you go up and you have all these harnesses on. And so people who love going up ladders, love being up, love heights. And people go up, windsmiths go up into the nacelle that has a hatch on it. You open it up and you go and you do maintenance on it. So I personally am not that big on heights, so I am not going to be a windsmith. And I was never very good at rock climbing. But so that's what's inside the nacelle. And some of our videos highlight that too, and we provided another one here to highlight that. This slide is meant to talk about the fact that I spend a fair bit of time talking to people about technology improvement. We have today, in practically every area of the energy system, we have compounding and cascading things going on in materials, in software, in all these things that are helping us reinvent in semiconductors, in these tools, and we're looking at things in ways we never did before on much more of a systems level. And so this is just a list of some of the things, I would argue there are more, that is helping drive improvements, not just in production, but in the resilience and the lifespan and the maintenance needs of wind turbines over time. I laughed at this slide because it's based on something in 2022, and we had the guts to say, This was built by GE and it's the world's largest and it's recyclable. Well, I'm glad it's recyclable, but there's no way it's still the largest because they keep making larger and larger turbines. So it was the largest then. But it gives you a sense, this is one of the onshore constraints are our roads and our road systems. These turbines are not modular. You can't snap them together like Lego. They lose their structural strength. In most cases, there's some people who've come up with some funky designs that says, well, let's break the blade into 3 pieces and assemble it on site. That doesn't work right now. We haven't figured that out. And so, like I mentioned, overpasses, the turn radius on a road, things like that limit what we can do in terms of, I made some notes here, in terms of factors, the restrict blade size, overpasses, hilly curvy roads, and FAA, so the Federal Aviation Association in the United States, and it's true in all other countries, with the height of turbines relative to radar systems, airport landing, things like that. Has anybody been to West Texas? If you go to West Texas at night, it's all these red lights on all these turbines just to help make sure people don't fly into something that's in the way. Okay, so this is a really important idea about all energy systems. I think when I was here before, I talked about Moss Landing that's down by Monterey Bay. It's a location that was originally developed for, so locations are really important. That's why I built a company called MAP. If you find out the right location for something, you can make that location more and more valuable over time from what it is at the day you first. So it's like getting a great house in a great strategic location or a great Starbucks location or Gott's own Town and Country. That's a great location, right? So Altamont Pass is a great location. You see those little spindly things that the whole Altamont had in 1980, and then you see the massive turbine in the background. This word repowering, so I was talking about Moss Landing. Moss Landing in the 40s and 50s, that location was valuable for a whole bunch of reasons, but we were burning oil to generate electricity. And then we got smarter and we repowered that location and we used single cycle gas, just burning gas once, which is not very efficient, but it was better than burning oil. And then we said, geez, we can do combined cycle now at Moss Landing. So we repowered Moss Landing again, same location. It became more and more valuable as we did that. And now Moss Landing has the biggest, for now, because it'll change very soon, but it has the biggest megapack Tesla battery pack storage facility anywhere in the state of California, for now. So we are repowering Altamont Pass. And this is a slide dedicated to talking about the before and the after. And you see we went from 438 turbines to 34 turbines on the same piece of property. And it was way more productive. And it had way fewer bird kills. And it had all these other really great attributes. And there's a hand up in the back.
How does battery storage integrate with wind, and what are the challenges with integration?
What we're seeing, the first wave of things has been to integrate solar and wind, and then to add storage to that. Our priority with wind is to build very large wind farms, because that is where we get the economy of scale on the overall cost. But the cash register of where the electrons flow into on a wind farm and on a solar project is the substation. And the substations, people like us who are developing these projects, we designed the substations first for the wind, then for the solar, then for the storage in our planning. But our goal, our primary goal, was to get that wind in, okay? Because storage is actually really expensive. It was then, the cost of storage has just come down really significantly in the last 3 years. And there's been lots of supply chain issues. So it's tricky because the interconnects for all three are separate. It's very rare to be able to file for an interconnect for all three together today. And so they're kind of stacked layers that you bring in later. But it's a great question. It just sadly is a longer answer. So, okay, so now we're switching to who manufactures this stuff. The answer is China, 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 China. The US, we have GE. That's it. And what this very colorful diagram is showing you where, so Goldwind, where when I had the China Energy Systems class, we would go visit their factories in China, and we do have Goldwind turbines in the US, and that's showing up in pink. China is building turbines, and then there's lots of rules, which is China will not let any non-China equipment be used on their wind farms. So there's all these national, and we're about to throw up a whole bunch of tariffs, and it's all going to get really interesting. So this is who has share in the United States. So if you looked at all the wind, let's see, market share of wind manufacturers, of the manufacturers, so we're not letting we're letting very little Chinese stuff into the United States. In terms of big components, some of the little components we're using. This is showing where we have manufacturing going on in the United States, but the components are largely coming from the countries you see there. But there's a lot of trade and, Secretary of State kind of debates going on about whose stuff goes where, and a lot of between us and China. This is who are the owner operators, who actually owns the megawatts. And in China, these are private companies, but there's enormous government control and participation. This is Europe. And then the United States, this is who the big players are. And depending on which data set you look at, you get different numbers about whose of these are more important and bigger. And as it says there, Berkshire Hathaway operates under 2 or 3 different logos. And so adding it all up becomes a little tricky. But those are the main people you should be tracking if you cared about wind. So that's showing waking effects. It's a great visual. So when we first developed wind, we were like, oh, we don't care if these turbines interfere with each other. And as we've gotten more sophisticated, we have really powerful machine learning and AI tools and things that look at the fluid mechanics, fluid dynamics of how these turbines and their airflows are interacting with each other. And we're getting much more sophisticated today. So when we repower a site, we do it like 3 times better than we did the first time. So it's really, really exciting. Remember, that same location, if you can get the location right, over time, you can really improve it and get more and more value out of it. It's true in oil and gas. It's true in any mining activity. What you're able to get early on is just your first wave, and then you get more sophisticated about extraction. In this case, we're extracting from the wind. So key elements: turbines, cables, substation, roads. A key idea that I'm not elaborating on a whole lot, but it's mentioned in the notes, is in oil and gas, you had to have an oil and gas lease because you had the mineral rights. The wind is tied to the surface rights. You have to have something called a wind easement. If I own land and Diana wanted to put a wind farm on it, she can't get anything done unless she gets me to sign a wind easement. Typically, that involves paying me money up front, just like in oil and gas, and that I would get a royalty on everything that comes out of that substation. So very similar agreement. That would be true if we were doing a CDR project. That would be true if we were doing a solar project. Normally in solar, it's typical to buy the land because you're using 100% of the land. Because here we're only using 3% of the land, and I am a cattle farmer. I want a royalty on the 3% of my land that's being used for roads and turbines, and that is a really great hedge on whatever's going on with my agricultural income. So farmers tend to really like, in the United States, can't speak for the rest of the world, they welcome having wind projects on their land. So this is me instead of Kirsten. I'm out in western Oklahoma. That is a Met tower. You can own them, you can rent them. If you're developing a project, so there's a ton of public data through federal agencies and various other sources, public domain data about where is the wind. But in order to get financing for a wind project, you want to collect detailed data on site at higher fidelity, because what people care about is what is that profile of the wind 24/7, 365. And the more you can predict the wind and what the fuel is going to be in its pattern over time, you get a better PPA. And so I'm just highlighting that measurement, correlation, prediction, these are all really important parts of, if you're going to develop a wind project, what you need. So you want to reduce the risk and increase the predictability. Anybody who's a finance person knows that are key things to that. In the notes, it talks about the fact the day, the season, the year, different wind regimes. That's why we collect. That's a Met tower, Jane and a Met tower. This is just talking about waking effects, and I'm not going to dwell on it because that's its own. The people who love fluid mechanics and hydraulics and things like that. There's a fabulous guy that was at Stanford for a while, John DeBerry, who's at Caltech. He's one of the wizards in this space. But all the big owner-operators have a whole team looking at waking effects right now. So when you're going to build a wind farm, ironically, your biggest challenge is the wind. So constructing a wind farm is a big operation. You set up big, giant lights. It's a 24/7, kind of like drilling, is a 24/7 operation. The cranes that you have out there are the equivalent of an oil and gas drilling rig in terms of that's the service equipment that you bring in to be able to assemble all this equipment, the towers, the nacelle, the blades, and pull them all up and get this done. It's a really exciting thing to be part of. But you have to operate 24/7 because you can only assemble when the wind is not blowing. Does that make sense? Because having things flying around on the end of a crane is not a really fun way to build a wind project. Okay, so this is important to talk about birds. So when we were developing wind projects really early on, there were a whole bunch of wind developers who were like, oh, we don't care about the sage-grouse. So the lesser prairie chicken, I don't know what the better prairie chicken is, but anyway, they literally call it the lesser prairie chicken. The lesser prairie chicken and the sage-grouse are two very protected birds. Ironically, around a lot of this bird stuff, I don't want to offend any hunters in here, but one of the most powerful lobbying groups to protect birds are hunters because they want to be able to kill them. They don't want the wind turbines to do it. It's very, very interesting. But in terms of where do you try and get a wind project built, you want to build in places where you don't have bird issues or bat issues and where communities want you there. So this is the reminder of the simple story, the KISS principle. Wind is very simple. The simpler things are, the less problems you tend to have. So you don't need fuel, you don't need water, you don't need to mine anything. Obviously, you do need to get the steel and the composites for the blades and things like that. So the big issues associated with wind is that site-specific issues and then the recycling of the blades. Those are the biggest issues, the wildlife issues, the visual psychology issues, and how do we find a good way to deal with end of life for the blades. This shows you what's going on in terms of how do birds die. Pretty morbid topic to put at the end of a lecture. But what's really interesting is this red point at the bottom is the utility industry shows you cats, building conditions, electric line collisions. Look at the number of electric line issues with birds. It's huge, barely regulated at all. So the wind industry is like the poster. It's like, yeah, that's the industry that kills birds. So the wind industry is really, really regulated around birds and has to manage that carefully. And the good news is they are like this with Audubon globally on wind stuff. But it's an important topic, if you're interested in wind, to spend more time on. There are very innovative people. You see all these solutions. There's a policy and practice program that's around eagle take permits. Those are the kinds of birds we really want to protect. There's all kinds of sighting guidelines. There's all kinds of tools now, sensors and lighting and signals that can actually send the birds away or bats that we didn't have before, these ultrasonic acoustics, things like that. So this is for people who are really good at solving problems, there's been a renaissance of solutions around how to manage avian and bat impacts. But I definitely want to own they're real, but and the wind industry really wants to manage them. But it does provide a wake-up call for all these other sectors where we're killing lots of birds. And this is one of the few times where you get to talk about it. Environmental site selection criteria. Ultimately, as I said before, when you're picking a site, you want to pick a site where people want wind power, where there's a good resource, where you can get an interconnect, and where there's load. You want all those practical, pragmatic business things, but then you need to overlay on it all these things that have regulatory, environmental, and adjacent things like the FAA aspects to it. And the FAA thing is a big thing. There's so many radars out there people don't know about, so many local airports you need to manage around. So it is really significant. A lot of people think wind farms are noisy. I'm very curious for those of you who go, how big an issue you think noise is. Altamont Pass, there are no people. So it's not like there's houses nearby. There's lots of regulations that make sure that people are not putting big giant wind farms in the middle of a neighborhood. There's work going on in the offshore to try and manage the sound and the vibration of wind turbines turning in terms of what effect is being studied it has on marine mammals underneath. And this is just showing an experiment, a testing going on can they have these bubble curtains that kind of create a distraction from that. This shows you, this is where it's a great place to have a wind farm. There's nobody there, okay? This is a hunting land or farming land of some sort. Very typical of what you see in Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, Texas, etc. This is making the argument about where does wind fit relative to other land uses and this 3% rule. So there's wheat land up in Minnesota, all these different views of wind farms. There's more wheat land in Oregon. So the economics, the gentleman right up here pointed out, this is incredibly cost competitive, really compelling economics. It was not that way 20 years ago, but again, we've moved into it. We've been doing all these things. The market pulled it, and the costs have come down. Costs have come down. I think they're not going to go to zero, but as these turbines get bigger, as the supply chains get more robust, they're certainly going to maintain their competitiveness. So it just shows costs falling. This shows what do we spend money on. I'm just going to click through these pretty quickly. Major factors that influence wind project returns, the quality of the wind, which is really embedded in the net capacity factor, the wind speeds, shown here. What drives success? What I don't have on here is if you have regulatory battles you have to fight, that drives the cost way up. Relevant policies. The most important policies for wind up until very recently, we don't need much policy support right now other than appropriate siting to make sure we respect environmental and human and the social license to operate. But the introduction of the production tax credit, hugely valuable, even though it was choppy. And what I don't have on here, Justine, that I should put would be renewable portfolio standards. Those state policies really mattered because this is biased towards the federal. So, and it just shows the march of policy relative to time and the scale of the turbines. This is a list of key policies. There are environmental regulations. There's renewable energy targets. There are financial policies that create tax benefits, much the way we have financial policies around manufacturing to try and domesticate things and reward people to build things that bring jobs into communities. Transmission policy is probably the most important thing that would make a huge difference to really radically improve that. It's tricky. It's managed by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Department of Energy, and the state PUCs. So getting everybody together is hard. So here, what's the leading cause of project delays? Grid interconnection, local ordinances, community opposition. Community opposition is something you can control. Managing grid interconnect issues is really, really hard and out of a lot of developers' control. This is a bunch of supply chain things, so we won't get into that, but I talked about Jones Act before. I mean, we have lots of rules between ourselves and other countries that impact a lot of the components of things that we're not currently building domestically. This shows you that line with a little more, you saw this graph before, but it shows this was the PTC expirations and the effect that it had. And this is showing with the federal tax credits that were brought in with the IRA that it makes wind essentially free. So it takes something that's already super competitive and turbo boosts it. If for some reason those were removed, wind would still be the most competitive source of energy along with solar. So offshore wind policies, incentives, we've got to have leasing incentives, transmission, tax credit provisions. So some of these things, if they go away, things for the manufacturers, these are all relevant things, normal things that countries, not just the US, provide. Transmission, transmission, transmission. There's local, that shows the CREZ that I mentioned before, which Texas taxed they use their state tax revenues. They said, we're going to build this. It's going to be good for the state. It's going to make us more competitive. And they were right. These are attempts being made to build high voltage direct current lines in the Midwest. And it's been incredibly hard. And China's built tons of this. Really, really hard to build. These are reminding you, you've seen this before in class, I believe, 28 states in DC have these standards, and this has been very powerful for wind and solar. In the future of wind, Bob Dylan called it, it's blowing in the wind. The future is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. So projections globally that wind is going to grow significantly. China leading, Europe in there. So rather than me getting into all the fine print of this, but the wind's going to wobble a bit, I think, in the US because of what's going on, but there is so much in the pipeline that on a lot of levels, 4 years doesn't really matter. The onshore wind is going to continue to go, and I think watching the offshore story in the United States is going to be very interesting. Europe and China are going to continue to address the conflicting interests of the offshore. What are all the things we need that environment for? And is it 3% out there? Is it going to get in the way of shipping lanes and things like that? We'll see, but I think it's going to be a priority. This is a forecast for the United States showing where will the capacity be and onshore and offshore for 2030 and 2050. And the good news is we know that forecasts are as good as the paper they're printed on. So this is just great. Let's do it. It's the DOE. Yeah, baby. But let's see what happens. See, if you save your PDFs and you look back 10 years from now, you can say, well, how good was the DOE then? It may not even be the DOE anymore 10 years from now. I think this idea that the technology is robust, it's compelling, it's competitive. The US and European players compete with each other the way Apple does with Google on cell phones and things like that. There's a small number of players who are really working hard to make this technology better. And little summary slide as I go into my, you're definitely too late, but I wanted to get to the part about, so this is a company that we've invested in called Heirloom, Breakthrough Energy Investors. This is a very different technology. It's much more microgrid oriented. We think it's very scalable. We think it can infill, that you can actually put these, so if you go to this website and read about it, you can actually put this, infill it on an existing big traditional turbine site, get more wind out of the acreage you already have. This is Aikido, which is in San Francisco, that's working on floating wind. There's small scale. We just got fun, cool things. So for the residential, just want to make sure people know there's some fun little videos. Here's a wind wall. There's a lot of cool stuff to try. There you go. That's Logan Air. Oh, that's Santa Clara, but Logan Airport has something like that. Thank you for being with me.